Whoop. Wow. How y'all doing? Good? Good lunch? All right. Got to have a quick understanding of who you are. You know who I am. How many of you here are actually working in a company trying to implement gamification with your employees? Okay, good. And the rest, how many of you would be considering yourselves providers of those services? All right. And anybody I forgot? Okay. I'm Chuck Coonradt. I wrote a book called The Game of War. Is my clicker. There we go. First 2 minutes, really important. Red, right. Wrote a book called The Game of Work in 1984. A couple of months ago, Forbes listed me in an article as the grandfather of gamification. So I feel a little bit like Philo T. Farnsworth, who, for those of you who don't know, invented television. And now coming back and watching everybody walk around with smartphones and iPads and everything else. You all have taken whatever I found and went nuts with it. So I had this slide, which I thought was really clever. You're going to get all of these if you want them. I had this really clever slide. And then Ross Smith came up. We saw him this morning. He's all the way back to the pyramids, so screw this. We don't have to worry about that. He's got more resources than I do. What do you expect? So, whoops, come back. Thank you. But I'd like to give you a little quick personal history for me. I was 1977. I was on a consulting engagement. I was selling a magic box of materials that was supposed to teach you engagement, involvement, and personal goal setting. And I was calling on a guy who was running a company where they made factory-built houses. They ran across the... And I would describe... Well, Jeff Foxworthy would describe him as a redneck. He was mid-50s, mid-career, not happy about either. And he was giving me the Kids Today lecture. Are you familiar with Kids Today? Kids can't work, kids don't care, kids don't have the values you and I have. How many of you got that as you were growing up? How many of you remember the first day you gave it? See, that's an ugly day because you realize you just became your dad. So I'm putting up with this, and he said, what are you and your box going to do about that? And that was from his second-story window down on the floor, 8 20-somethings building a house. To describe their work pace, you would need words like arthritic snails and wet cement. These kids look like mimes on downers. Move, move. He said, what are you going to do about that? If you've ever sold anything, you know when you get an obstacle you don't have an answer for, time stops. Lucky for me, I got rescued by lunch. And lunch bell rang, and those 8 guys dropped those hammers, took off on a dead run like they'd been hit with cattle prods, 50 yards down a factory floor to where they found a basketball hoop. I watched them play 4-on-4, skins on shirts, with the intensity of a Game 7 NBA Finals for 42 minutes. At the end of the 42 minutes, they put down the basketball, picked up their sack lunches, and started strolling back to the workplace where, at 1 o'clock, they were back on the clock, arthritic snails and wet cement. I looked at this old boy and I said, I don't think it's a raw material problem. And that was my indication and my inoculation, if you will, into what you all have turned into gamification. Well, what did we learn? I learned that people will pay for the privilege of working harder than they will work if you pay them. And that principle, the foundation of all the stuff that you are doing, is based on 5 key principles. And we learned them at recess. That's the beautiful thing. Gamification is not new. There's some allegation that was founded in Berkeley in 2004. It's 20 years after I wrote the book. Raj calls himself the father. I don't remember conceiving him. But here's what they are, and I'm going to try to share some principles from doing this for like 35 years, engaged with 4,000 companies. Number 1, the feedback's more frequent in recreation than it is in work. And for those of you who are trying to monetize gamification, get it out of an event and turn it into a process and make it sustainable. The thing that Chris talked about this morning being the universal profile, cradle to grave, hiring through retirement, we're going to give you a couple of principles that make sense. Number 2, the scorekeeping, and you all know this more than anything else, has to be contemporaneous with the process. The whole concept of an annual performance appraisal, if it was such a good idea, marriage counselors would recommend it. You know, so the next time somebody says, how was it for you? You might say, let me give you a written appraisal on our anniversary. I hate being politically correct. Okay, third, the goals have to be more clearly defined. And those goals have to have, if you're going to have traction in your company or you're going to have traction with your clientele, they have to have bottom line significance. Okay. Third, the coaching is more consistent. In the book I said we don't change the rules on you in the middle of the game. And last but not least, we want to talk about the power of personal choice. Now, I'd like to talk about the first and the last of these two principles today because I think that they are the ones that, as I've looked at the high-tech approach to gamification, we seem to have the most trouble with. So we looked at feedback from what I would call a contrarian standpoint. The denial or withholding of feedback is the most severe form of psychological punishment you can inflict on someone. Now, I don't want anybody to walk out of here going, well, he was an old guy and he said a lot of stuff. Not Chuck says. Help me with this. What's the worst form of imprisonment in our system? Solitary confinement. Why? No feedback, nobody to talk to. First step in brainwashing, isolation, separation from your comrades. Military academies called ostracization. Being silent treatment. The Greeks called it being ostracized. It's any time you put people away, can't get it done. Around our house, we just call it the big chill. You familiar with this? You walk home at night. Hi, how are you? Fine. What's wrong? What can I do about it? Okay, so when you look at that, let's look at feedback for a minute. Now, if you don't think feedback's important, try a couple of these. And if you don't think feedback's important, you all been through that deal? How do you like this? It's fine, get in the car. You apparently didn't hear the question. I mean, how do you like this? It's great. Let's go. Now, here's the reason. Capture this if you're looking at your notes. Feedback is how I know how I'm doing with you. When Chris talked this morning about 70% of employees are unengaged, and half of those are severely unengaged, one of the questions that Gallup can't get anybody to answer right is, do you feel appreciated in the workforce? That is a huge, huge treasure trove of motivation for your gamification to work. So, excuse me, if feedback's that important, we have to ask ourselves a question. Why don't players ask for more? And these are just some of the quick reasons. Nobody wants to be a wimp. And so the solicitation of feedback in our society is determined to be a character weakness. If you don't acknowledge that in your gamification design, you're going to miss. Hold on. Here's the other question. Why don't coaches give more? Really don't like the confrontation because, especially in American society, most of us were raised with this. If you can't say something nice about somebody, don't say anything at all, which is why most managers would rather take a beating than do a performance appraisal. All right? So that's the crisis, or that's the construct that I have spent the last 30 years engaged in. Let me give you the answers to some of this. Okay, there are 6 principles of feedback. We are going to kind of speed learn. Number 1, you have to reinforce the behavior you want repeated. Are we good at this in American business? No, we're terrible. We look at errors, rates, failures. Everybody wants to have safety. What do we track? Accidents. I don't know who figured that out. So you have to make a big deal of the good stuff you want more of. One of our most enjoyable implementations around this principle was with a major Coca-Cola bottling plant in Mobile, Alabama. They were really good at making Coke. They could also produce an accident every 30 days with regularity. It's like somebody had a strat plan for it. They took our principle and they said, well, how would we apply that? What would be the game of safety? And they decided to reinforce the behavior they want repeated by asking everybody as they left, or telling everybody, thanks for working safe today, drive carefully, we'll see you in the morning. Remember, they got an accident every 30 days. I still have the email from the plant manager where they went 377 consecutive working days without a lost time reportable accident in the plant. Reinforced behavior you want repeated. Need to learn to over-celebrate. Now that's part of what we're talking about in the gamification principle. But to get managers to do it, big challenge. Most people don't think it's professional. All right. I'm sure this clock is going at the wrong speed. The appropriate amount of feedback can only be determined by the recipient, never the giver. If you've ever tried to put a 3-year-old to bed before he or she was ready to go, you understand this principle, but it also works with big time. Principle 3, the delivery of inappropriate feedback. Appropriate feedback, most important human relationship skill you can develop. I'm going to challenge you because I've been looking for this for 3 decades. Can any of you tell me after the break a course or a school that's focused on doing this? No, doesn't exist. And here's the crisis to the counter term. Giving inappropriate feedback is the world's biggest morale killer. So I'm going to challenge you. How many of you here have been to a morale killing? If you were the perpetrator, keep your left hand up. If you were the victim, put your right hand up. You all look like the French army. Okay. 5 is that the person giving feedback is always in control. Now, I think you have to be careful that we're not trying to substitute mechanical software or a non-person as the feedback source in your gamification application. Because unless you get the feedback consistent in the tool with what my boss tells me, you've lost it. And that's a huge gap. We'll talk about that a little bit more before we finish up. And principle 6 is that people would rather take negative feedback than no feedback at all. Now, we see this most easily in children. You'll find a 4-year-old who comes in and says, Mom, Dad, let me tell you what I did in preschool today. Mom, Dad, let me talk to you about my room being clean. And we won't acknowledge them. What's the next sound you're going to hear? Busted glass, sibling scream, hacks on a dining room table leg. But is that kid going to get some feedback? Sure. Okay? The question is, why would that child act in a negative fashion? Now, as parents, we would say to get attention. But I'm telling you it's the application of this principle. So if you see somebody in an organization behaving in a way that is going to get them negative feedback, you have to go back and look at your instrument and see what positive feedback system is not working. Now, people are the key to this. It's not code. It's not bits. It's not all the trinkets. This is true. The way people feel about an organization dictated by the way they feel about their coach. And I told you I'd talk about 2 of them. Second principle is the power of personal choice. Now, personal choice is built into each and every one of us. It's what drives our economy. Look around. None of us are dressed the same. We're not in uniform. Many of you have jeans on, but other than that, okay? It's about personal choice. We all talk about engagement. You'll talk about anybody you've got, and they will say, the only problem with my tool is I can't get buy-in. Well, here's where buy-in comes from. Personal choice is what drives our economy. It's what drives our democracy. It's why we're willing to spill our blood on foreign soil to defend our right to vote, so that 2/3 of us can choose not to vote on election day. It's the most powerful thing in the human experience. I'll give you a lot of examples, but let me just put this together. How many of you ever used this phrase, have to? And when some of you said it and come into GSummit, where are you going to be on Wednesday? Well, I have to go to San Francisco. GSummit, they all laughed. But typically when you say have to, are you up or positive or feel more like a victim or more in control? And you use this more often when you're having fun on a golf course or a tennis court, or more often at, right? So is that consistent? What about this phrase? And when you say want to, all those reverse. So let me just share something with you. That your life, your joy in life, is how much time you spend in these two columns. Now let me ask you a really simple question. And I want you to think about this as you're designing your next instrument. Let's assume you're the customer. You're being served dinner or lunch today. You're listening to me. Somebody's shining your shoes, doing your hair or your nails. Can you tell whether the individual who's serving your needs is there because they want to be or they have to be? How long does it take? Nanosecond. Can you tell over the phone? Have you ever walked into a place of business and made a decision before someone said the first word? Absolutely. Universal principle. And can you and I agree, especially those of you who are trying so hard to take these principles into your company, that you want to create at XYZ organization a want-to philosophy? Would you agree? Because ask yourself this question. If I can figure this out in a nanosecond, are my customers as sensitive to this as I am? Absolutely. So here's the answer to putting that together. Every time you ask someone to do something, in a game, out of a game, any request you make for behavior, three things are going to happen. You're going to have to answer these three questions. Why do you want me to do it? What do you want me to do? And how do you want me to do it? Now, I need your help on this. When you are receiving instruction, which one of those questions do you want to have answered the least? How? I don't know about you, but I hate to be told how. Why do I hate to be told how? Because it says you don't think I'm smart enough to figure it out, takes away my choice, disengages me from the process. Critical to keep that in mind. Of the remaining two, which one do you want to be told the most? Why? All right? So here's the thing I would leave you with. That to important people, we insist on explaining why. If you're borrowing money, looking for a budget, trying to convince your padre, priest, or rabbi that you didn't do what they thought you did, any one of those kinds of things, you will why people to death. In fact, some of us have made a pitch they've bought, and we've said, hold on, I got more to tell you. Sales guys, we know, take the money and run. But to important people, we insist on explaining why. To unimportant people, we simply tell how. They can tell how we feel about them by the way we talk to them. Make sure as you build your gamification instrument, or you're building a process, including an instrument, that you take into account how critical this appreciation factor is for all of the people in the world. And you can find us anywhere in there. Thank you all very much for your attention this afternoon. You've done a great job.